A mid-sized manufacturer replaces its manual quality inspection line with an AI vision system. On paper, labor savings appear immediate and substantial. Headcount drops. Variable costs fall. Yet 3 quarters later, total operating expense has not declined. It has quietly moved upward in categories the CFO struggles to explain: vendor contracts, model retraining, data annotation, and thicker internal oversight. What looked like clean cost reduction has expanded the overhead base. This pattern is more common than clean automation narratives suggest. Automation compresses certain visible costs, while simultaneously inflating others that behave far more like fixed overhead. The net economic outcome depends less on model sophistication and more on how deeply these new overhead layers anchor themselves inside the organization under real operating conditions. At first glance, the substitution seems efficient. Sensors and inference replace repetitive human judgment. The direct labor savings register quickly on the P&L. But the infrastructure cost persists even when inspection volume falls. The system requires specialized talent whose compensation and retention costs do not flex with output, and it introduces layers of coordination that appear only after the system is in production. Consider two cost stacks. Before automation, labor scales with volume, while fixed cost remains thin. After automation, labor compresses, but fixed cost thickens through compute, monitoring, and integration layers. The total may fall at high utilization, yet the structure becomes less elastic. That schematic captures the core tension. The advantage is real only within narrow bands of stable, high-volume operation. Outside those bands, the overhead behaves like committed capital that resists contraction even when management actively seeks to reduce it. In practice, the expansion of overhead occurs through several predictable channels. First comes the integration tax. Legacy systems rarely hand off cleanly. The result is custom middleware, duplicated data stores, and reconciliation routines that migrate from one-time project cost into recurring maintenance budgets. What begins as temporary implementation expense quietly settles into structural baseline cost that resists later removal. Second is the monitoring and drift burden. Models require continuous attention as data distributions shift with new suppliers, environmental conditions change across factory shifts, seasonal variations appear, or new product variants enter the line. Organizations often trade one form of labor cost for another that demands higher skill levels and greater retention expense. Third is the governance layer. Automated decisions affecting quality, safety, or customer outcomes require structured human oversight, detailed audit trails, exception protocols, and periodic validation cycles. These functions tend to expand with product variation, not contract with scale. The cost appears controlled only while the operating environment remains highly stable and predictable, conditions that prove harder to sustain than most initial projections assume. The compression point arrives here. The system reduces visible labor cost, but it introduces fixed infrastructure, oversight, and coordination layers that do not contract with volume. The advantage holds only if inspection throughput remains consistently high enough to spread compute, monitoring, and support costs, and only if product variation, supplier changes, and operating conditions do not force frequent retraining and annotation cycles. The advantage is genuine, yet narrower than the initial business case implied, and more conditional than most capital requests acknowledge. What appears cleaner in the cost structure often proves more rigid and capital-intensive under real operating conditions. A further constraint appears when utilization becomes uneven. Production rarely operates at perfectly stable throughput. When volumes fluctuate across shifts or seasonal demand cycles, the fixed overhead does not adjust in parallel. Compute commitments, monitoring capacity, and support staffing remain in place even during partial idle periods. Idle capacity, therefore, does not remove cost. It only reduces the amount of output over which that cost can be spread. The effect is not just higher apparent cost, but a reduction in the effective return on the automation investment under real operating variability. Many organizations encounter this reality during the second or third year of deployment. Early pilots show strong returns under controlled conditions with limited scope and dedicated support. At enterprise scale, the support structures themselves become baseline cost. What was variable labor becomes fixed technology overhead, plus higher skilled labor that carries its own recruiting, training, and retention dynamics. The total cost curve flattens less dramatically than anticipated, and in certain volume ranges or during periods of demand softness, it can actually sit above the pre-automation line for sustained periods. This dynamic explains why cost transparency often deteriorates after broader automation initiatives. Traditional accounting systems were not built to trace the full life cycle burden of model maintenance, data quality gates, exception workflows, and hidden synchronization effort. Costs scatter across departments, making the true overhead difficult to isolate and manage when pressure mounts. Vendor relationships add further stickiness. Usage-based pricing often appears attractively variable, yet minimum annual commitments, premium support tiers, and data transfer fees create de facto fixed costs. What appears usage-based often becomes commitment-based once integrated. Once processes and data schemas lock into a particular platform, switching becomes expensive and disruptive. The organization finds itself tied to an overhead structure that resists unwinding even if production volumes soften. None of this means automation is uneconomic. It means decision criteria must shift from gross labor substitution metrics to a net view of the entire cost structure, with close attention to how much of the new cost base resists contraction during downturns or volume adjustments. Sustainable advantage appears only when the automated system reduces not only direct costs, but also the overall need for coordination and exception handling, when the domain is stable enough that model drift remains manageable over multiple years, and when genuine optionality over infrastructure choices is deliberately preserved. The capital reality operates only within these constraints.